Over the last 3 weeks, we have listened to 3 very harsh parables of Jesus. All metaphors of the coming kingdom. All dealing with the issues of rejection or refusal of an invitation freely offered. One commentary I read on these 3 said this: the first parable of the triad, the parable of the 2 sons, describes Israel's rejection of John the Baptist's ministry. The second, the wicked tenants, alludes to their rejection of Jesus' historical ministry. And this third parable, the wedding banquet and garment, refers to the rejection of the preaching of Christian missionaries on behalf of the risen Christ. Now, this may be what Matthew is trying to show us, but I'm not sure that's exactly what Jesus was trying to do. When we look at today's parable of the wedding banquet, we find it in 2 other versions. One in the Gospel according to Luke, and the other in the Gospel of Thomas. And no, Toby, that's not my book. While the Gospel of Thomas may not be a canonical reading, in other words, one determined to be true to the story of salvation as determined by the Council of Nicaea in 325, it does offer us an insight into what people then believed. And it was interesting to note that this is one of the parables that was included. When we look at the 3 different versions, we say they have significant differences. In Thomas's version, a man prepares a dinner and then sends his servant out to tell his invited guest dinner is ready. But each of the guests says something's come up, and they all ask to be excused. And when the man hears his servant's excuses, he says, "Go out into the street and find others so that they may come in and dine with me." And the closing line in Thomas's version is, "Businessmen and merchants will not be welcome in the places of my Father." Luke's version is similar, adding that the giver of the dinner gets angry. And to show his contempt for those who have done so to him, he offers the feast to those who his friends would have called outcasts. To the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Matthew, we see, takes it a step further. It's a king that the people reject, who do not simply turn the other cheek, does not just get angry, but instead enacts revenge for their rejection of his invitation. Here's the problem I have with Matthew's version. Where those in both Thomas and Luke come willingly to a dinner, to a feast, a banquet that they were not initially invited to, how many of those who come in Matthew's version would have done so willingly? Let's face it. Who would dare say no to a king who just killed the last group of people who said no? In Matthew, God sounds more like a spoiled brat than a compassionate and caring God. An image further reinforced when the man without the wedding cloak is thrown out into the street. Still, one does have to wonder that this man, knowing the king's vengeful nature, would have refused a cloak that traditionally would have been offered at the door for all those who did not have one. unless it was to show his discontent with being somewhere he really didn't want to be. So why this metaphor for the kingdom? Is it to teach us about God or us? Is it about judgment or choice? I think it's easy to say it's about God's judgment. And many people have gone there. And in doing so have used this scripture as proof, scriptural proof, that the Jews didn't get it and the Christians do. It's even taken on anti-Semitic tones by some to justify their actions against Jews and Israel. I just don't think, though, that is what Matthew is trying to show. Remember, he is writing his letter to the Jews, to Jews who are spread throughout the Roman Empire, trying to convince them that Jesus is a fulfillment of prophecy. So I highly doubt he would write it intentionally anti-Semitic, unless he just really wants to tick everybody off. But it could be a parable forewarning a type of exile. Now that's something Jews were very familiar with. You know, a time when God would turn his back on those who he has chosen to be his people and leave them to suffer the consequences of their choices. Consequences. There are always consequences for our choices. Some of them are significant, and others, not so much. But still, there are consequences. And I think that is why Matthew includes more of the story than either Luke or Thomas, who both focus more on the grace of the invitation than the responsibility we have to respond to God's invitation in the same way it is offered, in and through love. I'm not saying grace is not important to Matthew. Note that he does say both good and bad are welcomed and invited into the banquet. It's just, I think Matthew is more concerned about a truth that the Jews faced throughout the whole of the Old Testament. That as God's chosen people, it mattered how they responded to God's invitation to live lives of righteousness and holiness. Just as it mattered then, it matters today. Jesus turned the world upside down in that an invitation once believed to be only for a specific group of people is now offered to everyone. Here's where people get things a little confused. The invitation is not taken away from the Jews and given to Christians. The Jews are still invited. Don't believe me? Read Paul's letter to the Romans. Read the book of Revelation. It's just that the invitation now includes us. Because the spirit that once rested on a people now dwells within each of us. I'd argue it always has. But as we are, and as we have always been, the one part of creation that takes pride in itself and its own accomplishments, we chose not to see it in those who do not look like us, think like us, worship like us. What is the consequence of that choice? One consequence is the cross. The cross that stands before us as a constant reminder of the mercy and grace we have been invited to receive. Many of you probably have heard this before or remember it, but I'm I'm going to say it anyway. Mercy is not receiving that which we deserve. And grace? Grace is receiving that which we do not. We are invited to know God's love and to share God's love. How do we respond to the invitation before us? If I haven't been clear enough over the last couple weeks, let me be clear right now. It is in and through love. Remember, the defining characteristic of those who follow Jesus is love. Therefore, when we are invited by God to take part in the ministry of reconciliation, started in and through Jesus Christ, we don't say, sorry, God, I'm too busy this week. It's been a hard week. I'm tired. Maybe next time. You know, God, I'd like to, but we say yes. Then we do the best we can. We do all that we can. We do whatever we can. And we do it with God's help. It's not up to us alone. At annual council this week, we talked about change and how we cope with its uncomfortable nature. My takeaway from some of the discussions we had was that the only way we can cope with change is with God's help. Why do I bring this into today's conversation? Because God is constantly inviting us to change. We may not think we have anything left to change. We may think it's impossible to change. But God says, yes, we do. Yes, we can. If that weren't true, then God would not ask us to do the impossible. What is God inviting us to change about ourselves? The way we live in community. The way we know and share the love of God with those God places in our lives. What invitation do we struggle with? Do we set aside as too hard or too much? Or, I'd like to, but whatever it is, we are invited to pick it up, to pray about it, and to ask God for help in order to say yes with God's